And I'm going to keep talking about sweaters. What am I going to talk about this time? The transition, guys, from one decade to another. I love the transition, and the transition happens between the decades. We're going to talk about the late 80s, we're going to talk about the early 90s, we're going to talk about the transition of the colors of sweaters and the shapes from one decade to the other within just like a year or two. So what I'm going to show right now, we're going to start with these guys right here. This sweater right here is from the 80s. Look at that sleeve, look at those colors, look how long that is. We were wearing them really big and really long, you guys, towards the end of the 80s there especially. So now I'm going to pull that this way. I just want to show you how cool this is. Look how beautiful that sweater is. Isn't that thing really cool? So from there we went into the 90s. Now the 90s the sweaters became a little bit more fitted, a little shorter, a little bit more tailored towards the body. Now you're going to notice the similarity between these two sweaters, the transition to go from this kind of pattern and these bright colors to just full-on black and white. Got the checkers here, you got the check over here as well, you got the patterns happening, similar patterns, different types of sweaters, 80s into the 90s. Now I'm going to show this one here as well. This is also another transition happening here. First of all, we're going to show the 90s versus here, and then we're going to show the 80s one here. You're going to notice they both have really nice patterns on them. This one is brighter. The 80s was brighter, you guys. The 90s was more muted. We still have some interesting colors here. It's purple, but it's predominantly black. This is predominantly brighter blue, even though we have gray there. So there's the transition. We go from bright, muted, to really quite muted here. The 90s was much darker, much muted colors. Put that like this. We'll put that back there like this. I'm going to go with this one now. Check it out once again. Fairly bright, right guys? It's like a lot of bright colors going on here. Remember I talked about the album covers and the purples and the pinks? Now I'm going to show you the 90s. Here we go. We still have some bright colors, but this is way darker than this one here. It's also, you'll notice, similar shapes, but you know, the shapes are a bit different as well, guys. So you get something pretty bright here, something bright but muted. This is bright. This one here. I'm going to show you one more example, fine example of the 80s into the 90s. This is really late 80s right here. Look how long, big, etc. Look at those sleeves, guys. Look at that. Look at the shape of this. Okay, so we're still with the bright. You know, it's bright. It's getting muted though, right? It's not quite as bright as the other ones I showed you. Now we go on to the 90s right here. Much more muted, you guys. Way darker, shorter too. Not quite as big. Not quite as roomy as the other one. We're getting more tailored over here. So transitions, I'm really into. I love the transition. So once again, how do we know the difference between the 80s patterned sweater and the 90s patterned sweater? It's about brightness. It's about the shape. It's about big arms versus a tighter arm. It's about muted versus bright. It's about patterns becoming patterns, but more muted patterns. So how do we know the difference, guys? Bright versus more muted. I hope you all learned a little something about transitions of sweaters from the 80s into the 90s, and come on down and get into one of them today. All right.